A black man in a faded work coat slept slumped against the window of a late-night bus, one hand still clamped around two paycheck stubs, as if letting go meant losing everything. He had drifted past 3 stops without waking. 4 rows back, a woman in an expensive coat watched the exhaustion carved into his face, and she did not look at him the way strangers look at strangers. She looked at him the way someone looks at a memory. As the bus rolled through the dark edge of Kensington, she rose and walked toward him. The woman's hand hovered above his shoulder for a moment before she touched it, and the man came awake the way exhausted people do all at once, his body jerking upright before his mind had caught up. "You've gone past your stop," she said quietly. "A few of them, I think." David Richardson blinked at the dark glass at his own reflection floating over streets he didn't recognize, and the first thing he did was check his hand. The 2 paycheck stubs were still there, creased soft from being folded and unfolded, and only when he felt them did the panic in his chest loosen. He looked up at the woman standing over him, the tailored coat, the calm, the quiet way she held herself apart from the grime of the bus, and he could not place why a person like that would be riding the number 23 at this hour. "What stop is this?" he asked. "Somerset. You came through Tioga a while back." He said a word under his breath, not quite a curse, and pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. Tioga was where he lived. Tioga was where his kids were, where the neighbor girl who watched them was already counting the minutes until she could go home to her own bed. He had ridden this line for 14 months, and he had never once slept past his stop, and the fact that he had done it tonight told him something he didn't want to know about how much was left in him. He had spent the day pushing a cart of disinfectant down the 3rd-floor corridor of a hospital, wiping down rooms after the people in them had been wheeled somewhere better or somewhere worse. He had clocked out, ridden across the river, and clocked in again at a warehouse where he spent the night lifting boxes onto belts that never stopped moving. 16 hours, and somewhere in the last of them, his body had simply filed for the sleep it was owed. On the ride home, he had been trying to stay awake by running through Malik's reading homework in his head. The boy was 7 and stuck on words with silent letters, and David had promised to help, and he could remember reciting KNIGHT to himself, and then nothing. And then this woman's hand on his shoulder, on his "thank you," he said, and started gathering himself to stand. "I appreciate it. Most people don't. You looked like you needed the sleep more than the ride." He almost smiled at that. He got to his feet, steadied himself on the pole, and that was when the size of the problem settled over him. The bus wouldn't loop back for a long while at this hour, and even when it did, it would carry him the long way around. It was cold outside, the kind of damp Philadelphia cold that got into a man's coat and stayed. And back in the apartment, there was a teenager waiting to go home and 2 children who would wake if the door didn't open when it was supposed to. The woman seemed to read the arithmetic on his face. "I can call you a car," she said. "It's no trouble." The offer was gentle, and that was almost what made it worse. David looked at her coat again, at the phone already half out of her pocket, and something old and stubborn stood up straight inside him. He had never in his life taken a handout from a stranger, not when things were tighter than this, not when Zoe was born, and the bills came like weather. A car from a woman like this would cost her nothing, and it would cost him something he couldn't name and couldn't afford to spend. "That's kind of you," he said, "but I'll walk it. It's not that far if I cut back the right way. Clears my head anyhow." He could see her weigh whether to argue. She didn't. She put the phone away, and for a second he thought that was the end of it, that he'd step down into the cold and never think of her again. But when the doors folded open at Somerset and he went down the steps, he heard her come down behind him. "I'm headed the same direction," she said, falling in a half step to his side. "I'll walk a while." It wasn't true. David suspected it wasn't true the way you suspect a thing without being able to prove it. Nobody dressed like that walked these blocks after midnight by choice headed anywhere. But he was too tired to challenge it, and there was something disarming in the plainness of the lie, so he let it stand. and the two of them started up the empty sidewalk together, their breath showing white under the sodium lights. They walked without talking at first. He kept a careful distance, answered the one or two things she said with the kind of politeness that is really a closed door. He had learned a long time ago how to be pleasant to people who existed on the other side of a wall from him, the supervisors, the administrators, the ones who signed things, and he could do it half asleep. "Yes, ma'am. Cold night. Long shift." He gave her nothing that was actually his. He did not know her name, and she did not offer it. And the truth of who she was sat only a few feet from him without either of them touching it. Because the woman walking beside David Richardson was not lost, and she was not headed his direction, and she had not chosen the number 23 by accident. Her name was Elena Vance, and once a year she rode this line for a reason she had never explained to anyone. Her father had ridden it. Samuel had come home on this bus for the better part of 2 decades working the night dock at a freight yard, and one winter when Elena was 11, his heart had simply stopped in the small hours worn through, the doctor said, the way a rope wears through when it carries too much for too long. She had grown up and grown rich and built a life her father could not have imagined, and every year on the night he died, she came back to the 23 and sat in the dark and let herself remember the man who had raised her on a dock worker's wages. She had been remembering him when the man in the faded coat boarded and slumped against the window, and she had seen his hand close around those 2 paycheck stubs even in sleep, and something in her had come loose because it was her father's hand she saw. Samuel had come home like that, holding his stub as though it might be taken from him, too tired to unfold it. She had woken David before she had decided to, before she understood she was standing, because some part of her had been waiting her whole life to reach across those years and shake her father awake in time. She said none of this. She only walked beside a stranger who thought she was a stranger and matched her steps to his, and stayed a careful arm's length back so that a tired father walking home in the dark would not have to carry on top of everything else the small animal fear of a person too close behind him. "How much farther do you have?" she asked. "Mile maybe, little more." He glanced at her sidelong. "You really don't have to do this. I've walked worse." "I know I don't have to." They came to a corner where the light had gone out, and he slowed and put a hand out slightly, without thinking the way a person does at a curb, an instinct to keep the one beside them safe, and then caught himself and dropped it as if remembering they were nothing to each other. Elena noticed the gesture and said nothing, and something in her chest pulled tight. For a while there was only the sound of their footsteps and the far-off hush of the expressway. David had stopped trying to fill the silence. He was thinking about the morning, about how few hours of sleep stood between now and the alarm about the $11 in his wallet and the 4 days until payday. He was thinking that he had made it home 1,000 times and would make it home tonight, and that the children would never know how close the whole arrangement ran to the edge, and that this was the point that they should never know. "You have people waiting up?" Elena asked. "My kids," he said, and the word softened his voice despite him. "2 of them. The little one will be dead asleep. The boy fights it. He'll be up when I come in pretending he isn't." "How old?" 7 and 4. She didn't ask where their mother was, and he was grateful for that. Most people asked. Most people asked in a way that made him feel he had to explain himself, account for the shape of his family, like it was a thing gone wrong instead of a thing he had simply picked up and carried when it was handed to him. This woman only nodded, as if 2 children and a father walking a mile home at 1 in the morning were an ordinary and honorable thing, which was the only way David had ever been able to see it himself. They walked the last stretch mostly in quiet. When his own block came into view, the row houses leaning shoulder to shoulder, the one porch light he'd left burning, David stopped at the corner, unwilling to bring a stranger all the way to his door. "This is me," he said. "I'm all right from here." He looked at her, and for the first time the closed door in his face opened a crack. "I don't know why you did all this, but thank you. You didn't have to walk a stranger home." "No," Elena said. "I didn't." He nodded, hitched his coat, and turned up the block toward the porch light. And she stood on the corner and watched him go, watched a tired man let himself into a narrow house where 2 children slept, watched the light click off behind the door, and only when he was safely inside did she turn and start the long walk back the way they had come alone, now holding something she did not yet have a name for. There are men who carry an entire family on their backs and never once say the weight is heavy. We mostly don't see them. They're on the late bus on the night shift in the tiredest corners of the city, moving quietly through hours the rest of us are asleep for. And maybe the smallest kindness we're capable of is simply to notice them, to look for once the way that woman looked, and see the whole life folded into a pair of paycheck stubs held tight in a sleeping hand. Elena Vance did not sleep that night or most of the nights that followed. Her house sat on a wooded rise on the other side of the city, far from the row homes and the sodium lights, and for the first time in years, the quiet of it felt like an accusation. She would lie awake and see the hand again, that worn hand closing around the paycheck stubs even in sleep, and behind it, she would see her father's hand, and she could not make the 2 images separate. She had spent 35 years building a life at a great distance from the dock her father died on, and one stranger on a bus had collapsed the distance in a single night. What kept catching her, though, was something smaller and stranger than grief. It was the $11. He had refused the car without ever naming a reason, but she had done the arithmetic in her own head anyway, and understood that the man had chosen to walk a mile in the cold at 1 in the morning to keep a handful of dollars he could not spare. And she had thought lying awake about how her own days were arranged. She paid money to save time cars, waiting at curbs people to stand in lines she would never stand in, an entire architecture built so that no hour of hers was ever wasted. And David did the reverse. He spent his time to save his money because time was the only thing he had that the world would take in trade. The same city held both of them, and in it one kind of person lived by the clock and another kind lived by the wallet. And she had never once in all her comfortable years had to notice which kind she was. She did not even know his name. She had a face a block near Tioga, 2 children aged 7 and 4, and nothing else to hold. And she found she could not let it stay that way. The anniversary of Samuel's death had a way of pulling her toward the places he had worked. And in the days after the bus, she felt that old pull sharpen into something she could not sit still against. So on a cold Thursday, she had her driver take her out to the freight yard on Torresdale Avenue, one of her own night operations, a low-slung warehouse where trucks backed up to the docks in a long steel row and the belts ran until dawn. She told the site manager it was an unannounced walkthrough. That was half true. The other half was that she wanted, on a night when her father sat heavy in her chest, to stand for a while in the kind of place that had raised her. She came in through the floor rather than the offices, which the manager clearly did not expect of her, and she walked the aisles between the racks with her coat still on, watching the work. The men moved fast under the high lights, faster than looked safe feeding boxes onto belts that never slowed, and near the third bay, bent under the weight of a carton, he was swinging up onto the line, was the man from the bus. Elena stopped where she stood. For a long moment, she could not make it be true. She told herself she was tired, that she was seeing her own obsession where it wasn't. But he turned to reach for the next box, and the light caught his face, and it was him unmistakably. Him, the same tired eyes she had watched come awake on the number 23. He worked in her warehouse. The man whose mile she had walked, the man who spent his time because he could not spend his money, punched a clock that she owned. And then the rest of it arrived all at once, the way his body had come awake on the bus. 3 weeks ago, she had signed off on a policy her chief operating officer had brought her, a clean and clever thing dressed up in the language of efficiency. It capped the scheduled hours of the floor workers at 27.5 a week, just under the line at which the company would have owed them health coverage. Across all the facilities, it would save the company $4.7 million a year. She had read the summary and she had signed it, and she had not thought about it again, because it had been a number on a page and nothing more. She had never once pictured a face on the other side of it. Now she had a face. Now she understood that the reason the man from the bus worked 2 jobs 16 hours across 2 shifts was that no single one of them would give him enough hours to live on or a single day of insurance, because she had made sure of it. She had built the trap herself, priced it, approved it, saved $4.7 million with it. And it was the same trap, the very same one that had worn her father down to nothing on a dock, much like this one in the small hours of a winter night when she was 11 years old. She stood in the aisle of her own building and felt the wall come down the wall. She had spent a career keeping up the one that let a number on paper stay a number and never become a man's sweat, never become a mile walked in the cold, never become 2 children asleep in a narrow house waiting for a door to open. A whistle sounded somewhere for the break, and the belts wound down, and David stepped back from the line and pulled a phone from his pocket. Elena was close enough in the sudden quiet to hear him. "Hey, buddy," he said, and his whole voice changed the way it had on the walk when he spoke of his kids, the exhaustion draining out of it, something warm coming up underneath. "You still up? You're supposed to be asleep." He listened. I know you did. I'm almost done here. Go on and lie down, and I'll come check the reading with you in the morning, all right? Every word. Promise. Go to sleep." He put the phone away and stood a moment with his hand over his eyes, gathering himself for the second half of the night, and something in Elena's chest tore quietly loose. Because those were nearly the words her own father had said to her on the nights he called from the yard to tell her not to wait up, that he was almost done, that he'd see her in the morning. "Go to sleep. I'll see you in the morning." Samuel had said it 100 times, and one morning he simply had not come, and here was the same sentence spoken by a man on the same kind of floor, under a policy she had signed with her own name. She could have turned and gone then. Some cowardly part of her wanted to. But the break ended, and David turned back toward the line, and his eyes swept across the aisle and found her and stopped. She watched the recognition move across his face. First, the ordinary confusion of a man seeing someone out of place, then the slow understanding of who she was, not just the woman from the bus, but the woman the site manager had been trailing all night, the woman 2 supervisors near the office door were watching with careful, anxious respect. One of them said something to another, and the word carried across the quiet floor, "Ms. Vance." And then from the manager himself, hurrying over with a clipboard, louder, "Chairman Vance, if you want to see the loading data." David heard it. Elena saw the moment it landed. He did not shout. He did not throw anything down or come across the floor at her. What happened in his face was worse than any of that. It was the look of a man discovering that a kindness he had let himself trust had been something else the whole time, that the woman who had walked a stranger home through the cold, the one person in months who had looked at him and seen a human being, owned the very machine that was grinding him down. He had let her past his closed door for one night, and she had known walking beside him exactly what she was, except she hadn't. Not on the bus. But she could see that he had no way of knowing that, and that it did not much matter, because the fact of who she was sat there between them now like a thing that had always been true. Neither of them said a word. There was nothing that could be said across that distance with 2 supervisors watching and a whistle about to blow. David held her eyes for a moment longer, and then he turned and picked up the next box and swung it onto the belt and went back to work as though she were not there, which was, she understood, the only power he had left in that building, and he used it. Elena did not stay to see the loading data, but before she left, she stopped at the manager's station and asked, keeping her voice level, for the name of the man at the 3rd bay. Richardson, the manager, told her, checking the roster. David Richardson, 14 months on the night crew. That night, back in the house that no longer felt like rest, she opened the company's personnel system and typed his name. His record came up thin and clean. 14 months, and in the box where a supervisor rated each worker, there was the same phrase, quarter after quarter, in the flat language of the software meets expectations. 14 months and not one day marked off. Not a sick day, not a personal day, not one. A man had given her company every single day it asked of him, and the highest thing it had found to say about him was that he had met what was expected. She sat with the record a long time. Then she went the next night, and the night after, back to the Torresdale floor, not to be seen now, but to stand at the edge of things and watch, because she found she could not look away from what she had built. And on one of those nights, she went up to the dispatch office and stood behind the operator and looked at the screen that ran the floor. There it was, the whole system her own experts had designed, laid out in cool blue light. Every worker on the floor reduced to a line, a badge number, a throughput rate, a small figure ticking up or down against a target. She found his line. It did not say David Richardson. It did not say a man who recited spelling words to himself to stay awake, who walked a mile in the cold to save $11, who told a 7-year-old to go to sleep and promised to check the reading in the morning. It said a number and a rate and a green mark for on target blinking softly without a face, without 2 children, without any of it. That was all he was on the screen where the decisions got made. That was all any of them were. Elena reached past the operator and turned the monitor off. She kept coming to the floor after that, though she told herself and everyone else it was routine oversight. She was there 10 days after the night on the bus, standing near the office glass when it happened. David had been on the line for hours. She had watched him slow through the shift, watched the reach get heavier, the straightening up take longer, and she had told herself he was only tired the way they were all tired. Then, midway through swinging a carton up, he simply stopped. The box came down out of his hands. He put a palm against the rack as if to steady himself, and the steadying didn't take, and he went down onto the concrete all at once, his body making a decision his will had been overriding for far too long. For a second, no one moved. Then everyone did. Elena was across the floor before she knew she had crossed it, down on her knees on the cold concrete beside him, and he was gray and slick with sweat and not fully there. His eyes open but swimming, and she was saying his name, his real name, out loud for the first time, telling him to stay with her, telling someone, anyone, to call for help. Somebody was already on a phone. She did not let go of his hand. It was the hand from the bus, the hand that had held the paycheck stubs, and she held it now on the floor of the building she owned under the lights she paid for, and understood that she had put him here as surely as if she had laid him down herself. The paramedics came fast. They spoke the clipped language of emergency over him, the pressure too low, the color wrong, some word about his blood being thin, worn out, not enough of what it needed. They lifted him onto the gurney, and Elena climbed into the back of the ambulance behind him without asking anyone's permission, and rode with him through the dark streets to the hospital, watching his chest rise and fall, willing it to keep rising. And even in the middle of it, a colder problem was already taking shape, the problem that follows when the one who holds everything up falls. Somewhere across the city, a teenage girl was watching 2 sleeping children and waiting for a father who was not coming home tonight and would not be there in the morning to check the reading word by word as he had promised. There was no one else. Elena learned that in the waiting room, piecing it together from a phone David could not answer, and a neighbor's frightened voice. No wife, no grandmother down the block, no second adult anywhere in the arrangement. The whole fragile roof of that family had rested on one exhausted man, and the man was unconscious, and the only person standing in the gap was the woman who had put him there. So it was Elena Vance who ended up making the calls that night. Elena, who arranged for the neighbor to stay, who found herself near dawn standing in the doorway of a narrow room. She had no right to be in, looking at a 4-year-old girl asleep and a 7-year-old boy sitting up in the dark, pretending he wasn't waiting, asking her where his father was. She had built a policy to save $4.7 million, and it had brought her here to the one place her spreadsheets had never shown her the far end of the arithmetic, where a child sits up in the dark and waits. Any one of us can look at another person and see only a number, a title, a rate, a line in a spreadsheet, a green mark blinking on target. But behind every one of those numbers, there is a person trying quietly to live a decent life. Just remembering that much some nights is enough to make us treat each other differently than we do. David came back to himself slowly this time. not all at once the way he had on the bus, and the first things he knew were the sounds, the soft mechanical beeping, the hush of a curtain, the low talk of people in the hall. A hospital. He knew hospitals from the wrong side of the mop, and he knew from the tape on his arm and the bag hanging above him that for once he was the one in the bed. For a moment, there was only the flat panic of a man doing arithmetic in his sleep. The shifts he was missing, the money not being made, the children. Then he turned his head and saw her sitting in the chair by the window, and the whole shape of the last weeks arranged itself. Elena Vance had not gone home. She was still in the same coat, wrinkled now, and she looked as though she had not slept, and when his eyes found her, she straightened as if bracing for a blow she felt she deserved. "Your children are safe," she said before anything else. "The girl who watches them stayed. I made sure of it. Malik wouldn't sleep until I told him you were going to be all right, so I told him. I hope that was true when I said it." He took that in. Whatever he had been prepared to feel toward the owner of the warehouse, the woman who had walked his mile and never said her name, it complicated in the face of the plain fact that she had held his household together while he lay unconscious. He did not thank her. He was not ready to thank her. But the anger he might have thrown did not come either, and what was left was worse for her than anger, a flat, spent emptiness, the look of a man too tired to be surprised by one more thing the world had taken from him. "You knew," he said. "On the bus." "No." She met his eyes and did not soften it into an excuse. "Not on the bus. I didn't know who you were until I saw you on that floor, and by then it was too late for it to matter to you whether I'd known before. I understand that. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm only telling you it's true. A doctor came and went using words like severe anemia and complete exhaustion, and your body did what you wouldn't, telling him plainly that a man cannot run 16 hours a day for 14 months and expect his blood to keep making the trade." David listened and said little. When the doctor left, Elena leaned forward and told him carefully that the hospital bill was already handled, all of it, and that she wanted to give him something beyond that, enough to stand the family up enough that he would not have to climb straight back onto the belt the moment he could walk. David shook his head at the check she was describing before it existed. And in that small motion, a wrung-out man in a hospital bed refusing money he desperately needed, perhaps we should stop a moment to understand him. Because the money could have paid the bill, but what Elena was holding out was not really help. It was a way for her to feel lighter. Sometimes the hurried kindness of the people at the top is meant to heal the giver more than the one who receives it. And David, emptied as he was still clear enough to refuse to sell the one thing he had kept whole through all of it. "You want to write a check," he said slowly, "so you can feel like the story ends here. It doesn't end here for me. I go home and it's the same hours or no hours, the same choosing." He looked at her and there was no heat in it, which made it land harder. "Your policy made me pick. Be the worker who shows up every day and never misses, or be a decent father to those kids. I tried to be both. My body couldn't carry your math." The word "your" sat in the room. Elena did not defend herself. She had spent her whole career letting numbers stay numbers, and she was done doing it. And then, because she owed him something truer than money, she told him the thing she had told no one. "My father did what you do," she said. "The same work. The night doc, the shifts that don't end. His name was Samuel." Her voice held barely. "He came home on that same bus, the 23, holding his pay stub the way you were holding yours. I woke you because for one second I thought you were him. And one winter when I was 11, his heart just stopped. Worn through, they said. He carried too much for too long, and it wore through." She looked at her own hands. "I spent my whole life getting as far from that doc as a person can get. And then I built the same doc. I signed the same policy that killed him, and I saved $4.7 million doing it, and I never once saw a face. You're the first person I've ever told that my father died the way you almost did tonight. In a building I own." David said nothing for a while, and the machines filled the quiet. He had walked into this expecting a rich woman's guilt, the kind that buys its way clean. What he got instead was a daughter who had discovered she had betrayed her own father in strangers over and over without ever knowing their names. There is a particular blindness that belongs to the people who design the systems the rest of us live inside. They are the last to see the ones the system breaks, because a person at the top looks at a spreadsheet and a person at the bottom looks at a life, and the higher you sit, the more the faces dissolve into figures. Elena had sat at the very top, and it had taken a stranger on a bus wearing her own father's exhaustion to make her see even one face. That it turned out to be her father's, after all, was the cruelest arithmetic of the whole thing. She did not ask David to forgive her. She understood sitting in that chair that forgiveness was not the point and was not hers to request. What she owed was not an apology to one man. It was the dismantling of the thing itself. She went back to work the following week with that purpose, and she learned quickly how much it would cost her because the machine she had built did not want to be unbuilt. The policy that capped the hours had not been hers alone. Its architect was her chief operating officer, Marcus Feldman, a man who had spent 20 years turning human beings into throughput and had grown rich and certain doing it. When Elena laid out what she wanted, real hours, real coverage, a floor beneath the people on the floor, Feldman heard her out with the patience of a man who believes the fever will break on its own. "You had a scare," he told her. "A man collapsed and you rode in the ambulance, and now you want to give away $12 million in margin because you feel something. I understand feeling something, but you don't run a company on it. The board didn't put you in that chair to lose money because you met a sad case on a bus." "He isn't a case," Elena said. "That's the whole disease, Marcus. You've said case your entire career and never once had to learn a name." Feldman did not raise his voice, and that was how she knew he was dangerous. He simply began in the days that followed to make calls. He went to the shareholders one by one with a quiet, reasonable story that the chairman had lost her judgment, that she was letting a personal wound bleed into the balance sheet, that a woman running a company on grief was a woman who needed to be relieved of it for everyone's protection. And he found listeners. $12 million is a persuasive argument, and there were people around that table who had never had to walk anyone's mile. The betrayal that hurt most was not Feldman's. She had never expected loyalty from him. It was Raymond Doyle. He had been her mentor when she was young and hungry, the man who had taught her how to read a room and hold a company, who had stood at her side for 2 decades, and called her more than once the daughter he never had. When it came to a vote, Raymond went to Feldman's side. He told her it was for her own sake that he was saving her from herself, and she understood then that she was going to have to do this nearly alone. She did not go quietly to the board meeting the following Monday. She went ready to lose everything she had spent her life accumulating, and she had decided that if it came to that, she would rather lose it doing this than keep it doing what she had done. To hold the votes she needed, she put her own weight on the scale in the only language the room respected. She pledged a large share of her personal stock against the cost of the reforms absorbing into her own account the losses the company feared, so that no one at that table could say the workers were being lifted out of anyone's pocket but hers. It cost her a fortune, and it cost her something harder to price a piece of the absolute control she had held for years, a controlling grip loosened so that others would come along. She would keep her chair. She would not walk out of that room the untouchable figure who had walked in. She had decided that, too, was a fair trade. And when it was her turn to speak, she did not give them the language of strategy. "Most of you have heard by now that I rode in an ambulance with one of our night workers," she said. "His name is David Richardson. He has a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, and he was working 16 hours a day across 2 jobs because the policy this company approved, the one I signed, made sure no single job would give him enough hours to live on or a single day of health coverage. We saved $4.7 million a year that way. I want to tell you what I bought with my share of it." She let the room hold still. "I know what that policy does because it is the same policy that killed my father. He worked a dock like ours. He carried too much for too long, and one winter it wore his heart through, and I was 11 years old. I spent my whole life running from that. and then I built it here and put my name on it and called it efficiency." Her voice did not break, and that was more frightening to them than if it had. "If this company cannot feed the people who make the whole thing move, then this wealth of ours is a disgrace. And I know that it is a disgrace because it already took my father. I will not let it take theirs." The vote was close. Marcus Feldman fought it to the last count, and Raymond Doyle would not meet her eyes, but it carried. The floor wages went to $19 an hour. The scheduled hours went up to 32 past the line the old policy had been built to dodge, so that full health coverage came with the work. And a fund was set up small at first, then not so small to help the night workers pay for the child care that a night shift makes impossible. It was not charity. Charity she could have written from her own checkbook in an afternoon. This was the machine itself rebuilt so that it stopped doing the thing it had been built to do. 5 months later in March, the light lasted longer. David Richardson rode the number 23 at 6:30 in the evening, and the sun was still up over the row houses when it came. He sat by the window, and he was not wearing the warehouse uniform because there was no second shift to change into anymore. He held one full-time job now with coverage, and it was enough, barely carefully, but enough, and the difference between barely enough and not enough is the difference between a life and a trap. In his lap was a drawing Malik had made him 3 figures in crayon holding hands, a tall one, and 2 small ones under a yellow scribble of sun. He got home while it was still light. He cooked standing at his own stove at a decent hour, and Zoe climbed into his lap the way 4-year-olds do without asking sure of her welcome. Malik looked up from the table where he was working through a word with a silent letter in it. David had checked the reading every morning since he came home, every word as promised, and studied his father's face with the seriousness of a boy who watches more than he says. "You don't look so tired anymore," Malik said. David pulled the drawing closer on the counter and did not trust himself to answer right away. Across the city on the late run of the same bus, Elena Vance still rode the 23. But she did not come now to find her father in the past. She came to look at the people around her as what they were, the living, the ones who could still be reached in time. Near the back, a man had fallen asleep against the window, a lunch cooler between his feet, and when the bus jolted, a folded slip of paper slid from his loosening hand toward the aisle. Elena reached down and set it gently back against his fingers before it could fall, and this time, watching the tired stranger sleep, she found she was smiling instead of aching. The circle had closed. The grief had finished becoming something else, something with hands, something that reached. To wake a person, all it takes is a hand on the shoulder, but to stay and help them stand, that asks more of us than a touch. It asks that we look straight at what is hard in another person's life, and that sometimes we find the courage to repair the very things we had a part in breaking. None of us can fix all of it, but any of us can begin from right where we're standing.